Hi, I'm Cecelia Klein, and I foolishly agreed to lead this discussion, but I thank you for giving me the invitation. I wanted to follow in Xochitl's footsteps. She led the discussion yesterday, and she tried to bring the talks that we've been hearing into the present. In other words, make them relevant for today. And so I decided to structure a couple of questions, which I'll throw out before people get to jump into the fray, around a theme that emerged when I was reading the very few papers that were submitted to me in advance. And the general theme of these questions has to do with truth. Truth. There's something that we think about a lot today, and we hear a lot about it today. We hear about gaslighting. We hear about alternative facts. We hear about fake news. And basically, we're being told that there are multiple truths, which is equivalent to saying there is no truth. So how did I get onto that? The first person who sent me his paper was Kevin. And Kevin's was therefore the first one I read. And on the first page of that draft, Kevin said, quote, "I am not concerned with ferreting out the truth from the different accounts, as if such a thing could be done, considering that many questions about what really or most likely occurred cannot be resolved based on the evidence at hand. Rather, I am interested in examining indigenous images and texts from the period that present alternative narratives of the past that contradict the official story." That's the end of the quote. Well, that dropped out of the final version. But it was provocative. I thought, well, okay, he's giving a nod to Hayden White and the postmodernists, and you know, he's warning us, don't expect me to give you the truth. Then I read, but then you read on, and at the conclusion, and he kept this in, he said, quote, "For this reason, I find these writings to be more credible than many other accounts that entered the Imperial Archive," end quote. And I thought, more credible. But what's that mean? Do you mean that you're closer to the truth? That you're flirting with the truth? Or are you just talking about believing and about faith? So then I turned to Lisa's, because that came in next. And Lisa also avoids using words like truth and true, or more true, or untrue. Not happening. She instead describes what she called in the original draft important correctives to the triumphalist narratives of Spanish histories, end quote. Now that changed. I think that dropped out, and in the version that we heard, it became about counter-narratives. Then you hear other people talk about better understandings. What we're trying to get here is a better understanding, right? What's that mean? So then I started thinking, are these euphemisms? Are people afraid to talk about truth? Or have we bought into this idea that there are multiple truths and alternative facts? Then I read León's. And that was interesting. León was having none of that. He does use the words truth, and he used the words true. Now, I can only speak to the draft because I missed the first part of the talk there today, but on page 3, originally at least, he wrote, quote, "The truth is that the area of central Mexico was a veritable mosaic of city-states and confederacies." And later, on pages 12, 13, as he's wrapping it up, he says, quote, "The truth remains that it was this manpower that allowed Cortez to achieve victory in August of 1521," end quote. So the question is, how do we as scholars, working with material very distant in time, see our work and our field as relating to the truth? Do we wish that word would go away? Do we think we have no claim on it? Or are we tiptoeing around? So that led to a second question. And that question also has to do with truth. To what extent do we as scholars contribute to the problem of determining what may be truthful? And the reason that I ask that is that the first 2 or 3 papers that came in all talked about Sahagún's depiction of the massacre of Tlatelolco. After a while, I thought, if I see this again, I'm going to scream. And it was always in the context of how there it is on the very first page of the entire book 12. Wow, you know, they really gave that primacy. And then you'd hear about the blood and the gore and what apparently happened. Well, that struck me as kind of interesting. Because if you flip forward quite a few folios to the section in Book 12 where they really do talk about the Toshkat massacre, what you see are 7 pictures of what the scribe says is an image of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec sort of supreme or paramount deity. Only Josh even thought about showing you this. There's a very minimal Spanish text, a paragraph virtually, at the very beginning of that section, and all the rest of the space that would ordinarily be taken up by the Spanish translation of the Nahuatl is actually occupied by these pictures. 7 of them, and nobody talked about them. What was important to the people who put Book 12 together? Why are those pictures where they are, and the Toshkat massacre has been moved? Well, we think it's been moved. I actually have started thinking that maybe whoever it was that thought that these pictures of Huitzilopochtli were very, very important had that scene of the massacre displaced to make room for these. The Nahuatl text is very lengthy. They talk about the making of this dough image in great detail, but we as scholars passed over it. We want to talk about guns and clubs and broken bodies. So thinking about that, I thought, well, we all do that, right? We pick what we want to talk about. We pick what we think is important, but I don't think it's always what was important to them. Okay, so this is even more interesting because that is probably not Huitzilopochtli. And I'm showing you why, part of why I think so. But there are lots of reasons to say that. For one thing, no other text puts Huitzilopochtli at the festivities of Toshkat. He is not part of Toshkat. The person who is, of course, is the deity Tezcatlipoca. Second, we don't have ostensibly maybe one or two. We have one or two pre-Columbian figurines that may represent Huitzilopochtli. They don't look anything like that. We have lots of colonial images of Huitzilopochtli, and they don't look anything like that. So is this who it is? If you go to Duran, and Duran is not talking about Toshkat, he's talking about the temple of Tezcatlipoca, and he describes for you what the statue of Tezcatlipoca looked like. And my God, he is describing that guy. And then when his native artist makes a picture for him, that's what it looks like. A cape with skull and crossbones, feathers, down feathers in his hair, etc. So it's probably not Huitzilopochtli. Well, if it's not, who got it wrong? The scribe, who is a native, consistently says it's Huitzilopochtli. So did Duran get it wrong? Did the artist screw up? I doubt it, because I don't think they would have let him put 7 pictures in there if he had the wrong god. This is kind of interesting, because this poses a lot of important questions about authorship, and it raises the question of whether indigenous voices and indigenous artists can sometimes get it wrong. And I say that because there's been an underlying assumption throughout this symposium that the closer you can get to the indigenous voice, the closer you are to the truth. And don't tell me that's not what you think you're doing. That is what you're doing. That's what Berenice is doing with those translations. That's what the art historians are doing when they deconstruct a picture. Why can't we admit it? I think it's a good question. So that's my thing. I'm done. But let's start with the question, Kevin, why did you take that out?
Well, Cecelia, remind me in the future to never send you a draft of or maybe I should just stamp draft on it. No, you got me there. I thought about that. I said, no, we are interested in seeking the truth, and I took that out. What I consider to be credible means that I understand the colonial context of many of these histories, and those that are directed to the crown are really carefully crafted, and I think Cortez's letters exemplify the type of carefully crafted document to the crown, where he's very careful about everything he says. I find these different. I respect Federico's point, though. He made an excellent point at the end of his presentation that just because these Tlaxcalans are really directing this to the crown doesn't mean that this is not true. They probably did go everywhere. They went to all these places with the Spaniards. Whether they did everything they said they did is subject to scrutiny, just like all of these documents are subject to scrutiny. And I'm not arguing that the indigenous accounts are, by nature, more credible, believable than the Spanish accounts. But my argument was, and I stick by it, that they're not sending this to the crown. In fact, these are subversive accounts. These are the types of accounts that might even get them in trouble if someone were to read it. And they had to be very careful in Book 12, because it was, in a way, directed to the king, although, was the king ever going to read the Nahuatl? The king would read the Spaniard if he ever saw it. He would read the Spanish, and that's why Sahagún was so concerned with the Spanish. So in the case of these images of Huitzilopochtli, they come in a chapter that precedes the massacre. So there's great attention to Huitzilopochtli. In fact, the Spanish part of that book is longer than the Nahuatl part. There's real interest on the part of the Spaniards, it seems, in Huitzilopochtli, in his accoutrements, in the details. In the following chapters on the Toshkat massacre, there's very little Spanish, and there's lots of graphic scenes of violence. Yeah, so thank you.
Well, I've just grabbed this microphone to say that I think one of the things that we think we see is that from the moment the Spanish land on the mainland, they're covering up. And they're covering up, and they're creating they're trying to create as clean a story as they can. And one of the things that happens by the time we get to Toshkat is that we've got the murder of a king. And a pagan king is a crime against God. And I think Charles is going to suffer for that. Shakespeare's going to be dining out on it in the next 100 years. So because there is a cover-up going on, how do we find the other pieces that don't necessarily agree with one another? Because these are so many different indigenous peoples that they cannot see the same part of the elephant at one time. So I don't think we're trying to grasp at a single truth, but trying to see the faceted nature of the experience in a way that recovers part of what was covered up.
All set.
Well, Cecelia, since you alluded me to in this debate about the truth, maybe this is a difficult subject, but let me just give a few remarks, okay? And can you hear me? Okay. So the truth. Well, we as historians, we are trained to seek for the truth. However, philosophically, you want to define that, even in these days where the truth is being negated, both by the left and by the right, by the way. And we are trained also to seek the hidden agendas and the unconscious assumptions of those who produce historical documents, be them documentary or even archaeological or oral. So indeed, I'm concerned with the truth, but I'm going to tell you why I'm especially concerned with the truth about this episode. And this is because I don't see it from a distance. This episode is myself, is my body, as well as Federico's or Manuel Aguilar's body. So we are concerned about inquiring on every single available document that we have, be it Spanish, indigenous, oral, or archaeological, because it's our lives on the land line. It's our own notion of self and of our own society, which is so besieged today. So we're not looking at it from a distance. We're not even trying to see whether the Indians were victims and the Spaniards were devils, or if the Indians were barbarians and the Spaniards were saviors bringing Christianity. We are trying to attempt to inquire, who are we? As our colleague and dear teacher Eduardo, who's first in line about this, because he still conserves in his body the ethnic identity of an Nahuatl-speaking person. He talked about the oral tradition in his town, assailed as it's by defective educational services on the part of the state. And I noticed, that some of his students would say, well, the conquest is bad because the French, And I was thinking how right that person is. This conquest started perhaps in 1519. It continued in the 19th century with the French. It continued in the 19th century with the Americans. It is continuing today, and that's why we see those documents, the beautiful paintings here in California, where this conquest is going on. You know, we've been shaped by the assaults, the violent assaults, first perhaps of the Mexica, if you want to see it even from pre-Hispanic times, then from the Spaniards, then the French, and now the Americans. So we are putting our self and identity and our interest in the truth of knowing who we are by inquiring in Mexican history. I don't want to be a nationalist, but that's our perspective, and I think that I can speak for Federico to make you have much more insightful things to say.
Well, yeah, I think that the whole discussion about the truth is very significant because it goes to the core of how we perceive the conquest itself and its effects on our present. But also, I think we'll never find the truth about what happened in those 2 years. Because, I mean, from a historical point of view, the transformations that were unleashed as soon as the Spaniards arrived in Mesoamerica and the war that started right after that, and the whole process of transformation was so significant and so vertiginous that, I mean, it's almost impossible to try to reconstruct it in its present. And besides, we have no source about its present. The only source that's contemporary to the events, which is Cortés, is basically not a truthful account of the events, but a judicial version meant to produce a certain, meant to obey a political strategy, basically to save the heads of Cortés, who was there as a traitor. So he's basically constructing an argument to save his own life and to save the life of his comrades. And what's important here is also, another factor that would prevent us from knowing the truth as a single entity is that this was, of course, an intercultural exchange. But not only, as many have said, it's not only the Indians and the Spaniards, but it's the many different indigenous peoples and groups that participated, the women who were all the cooks and the concubines of the Spaniards who were living with them intimately from very early in 1519, and who kept them alive all those 2 years, because without the support of these women, many of the Spaniards would have died. Many more would have died that actually died. So that's one perspective, and I'm sure their perception of what was happening of the Spaniards and everything was quite different from that of Moctezuma, or of that from the Tlaxcalan nobility, the males. And of course, there's a whole plurality of perspectives also within Spanish society. I mean, it's not, the view of Cortés, who was supposedly this strategical mastermind that had this plan, was not the same as the view of his captains, who many oftentimes didn't agree with him, and also was not the same as the view of his foot soldiers, like Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who basically never understood what was going on. And that's assuming Cortés understood, which I'm increasingly doubtful about that Cortés also understood, but the foot soldiers understood even less than Cortés. Or maybe they understood a completely different kind of conquest in which they were interacting with indigenous women, they were trading continuously with indigenous persons, and they were becoming enmeshed in the reality of Mesoamerica, even though it was not a political or above and beyond the military struggle. And also, there's this intercultural nature of the events means that there was no single truth even as the events happened, because the interpretation of the events that was made by all these different groups were different and they were incompatible. I mean, there was no way, there is no way, I don't think there is any narrative possibility of building a narrative of the conquest that can encompass all the different perspectives of the conquest, because there is no point of view from which this narrative could be written. I mean, we are not, and that goes to the point of the conquest continuing today. Even today, in the 21st century, we are part of these relations that started to be established in 1519. And of course, Leon is right when he says that the conquest continues, but I would add that basically the worst conquest experienced by Amerindian populations in Mexico has been carried out by the Mexican nation state. It's the Mexican nation state that forbade their languages. It's the Mexican nation state that carried out the dispossession of their lands. It's the Mexican nation state that has forced them to flee, many of them to the United States. It's the national Mexico state that has committed genocide against the Yaquis, against the Mayans, and is currently engaged in genocidal policies in many regions of Mexico. So it's not only a question of Mexicans against foreigners, but it's also a question within Mexican society of different groups who are still performing the relations of the conquest in contemporary Mexican politics. So even today, there can be no single truth about the conquest. The conquest is not the same when you are an academic writing from a privileged and secure position in Mexico City, as it is when you're a woman exposed to feminicide, to threats. There is no, I think that what we need to explore is the possibility of writing parallel histories of the conquests, of seeing how different truths illuminate particular aspects, but no single truth will ever emerge, I think. I think that we need to learn to live in this world of negotiated and contested truths, because it's a world of negotiated and contested rights, of negotiated and contested politics, of negotiated and contested death, even, sadly. So I think that's that. And on the other side, addressing your last question about the indigenous voices also having it wrong, of course they do have it in wrong. I mean, it's not a question of their indigenous voices being necessarily more truthful than Spanish voices or than European or Western voices. And those generalizations are so huge that, I mean, not all Western voices are alike, and not all indigenous voices are in agreement or say the same things, of course. But also, one of the points here is also that for a long, long time, we've only heard one kind of voice. Yeah. We've only heard the voices of the Europeans, the voices of the males, the voices of the groups who exert domination. So what's important now is to hear these other versions, not because they're more true, not because they are truer, but because they are other truths that have not been allowed to be heard. And I think that giving them a space to be heard is fundamental for building another kind of history that is not the continuation of this dominant history that serves to continue the colonial process and to serve to continue the oppression of the people that have been subjected, but that allows for a negotiation of the truth in the present, of a negotiation of violence in the present, but also a negotiation of the truth and of violence in the past.
I also agree wholeheartedly with the comments that the other panelists have made here. And I guess one thing that I would say is that I was trying in my talk to really focus on the power of indigenous language to tell a different type of story. And I guess I would take issue a bit with the idea that the scenes of violence that are narrated are less important or not as interesting as the images, in that if we look at many different Nahuatl language accounts, as Kevin pointed out, and that I didn't have time to do today, those scenes of the massacre, the brutality of the violence, and violence from Yucatan to central Mexico and then beyond just comes up again and again in those indigenous language accounts. And I think I was also trying to point out that I was not so much looking for the truth, but at the way in which we might understand this text as a history that comes out of a particular historical moment. And we've done a great job, I think, in the last few days recognizing the multicultural dimensions, or the various perspectives that are represented there. But But also I wanted to really kind of come back to the historical context. But could I just say quickly, in response to the question, are we part of the problem, right? I actually would say no, that, I think a lot of the work that we do, all of us as professors in the classroom, is to ask our students to think critically, to read critically, to consider who is the authority, whose voice is being privileged in different sources that we're reading. And so I think that the work that we do is really critical to helping to sustain our democracy, especially at this time.
Okay, I'm just playing devil's advocate because, of course, I'm on your side. But why? Why do you do it?
Pardon me?
Why do you want to create this other narrative or reconstruct this narrative?
I think that Eduardo has given us a pretty incredible charge, right? That this history matters, right? This history matters. It is not just an intellectual exercise. It is not a thing of the past. Even the other day, our son came home to us and was complaining how Eurocentric his history course is as a sophomore in high school, and realizing that, wow, nobody really hears the other side of the story. And this is, Sandy Rodriguez's paintings tell us, right? These narratives of the colonial legacy are informing the policy right now that allows for the, persecution of children and families. And so I think the whole 500 years of images also is another way of just showing how different perspectives are privileged given the historical context and the concerns of the producers. But I think this, I think this is not just, convenient because it's a 500th anniversary. I think these are critical issues that we have to engage in if we're going to really address issues not only in Mexico and Latin America, but in our own nation about incarceration, institutionalized racism, inequality, and a variety of other critical issues.
Thank you. I wanted to hear that.
We have to wrap it up. By the way, Sandy Rodriguez, can you say hi? We have to wrap things up, so I'm going to take the privilege to just say a few more words. And I, of course, agree with my fellow panelists about this idea of this fragmented nature of truth and these parallel histories and truths. And I personally feel always very suspicious when I hear this claim to truth, because I feel that it's so often, as we see today, used sort of as for political propaganda and to justify really horrible things. And I wonder if maybe rather than trying to, seek out the truth, that we maybe cultivate empathy for other people's individual truths and learn about other people's realities, because I think maybe then we can avoid shit shows like these. So with that, maybe with that, we can, I thank Cecelia for her always provocative questions. This is why I invited her to come and talk. I thank all the panelists. You guys were fabulous. And I invite all of you, thank you for coming, and I invite all of you to come out to Cal State LA tomorrow and see day 3 of our symposium.